Hello, and welcome to the How to Conduct an Assessment of Performance webinar. I'm Sandra Binns, Senior Officer for Access and Participation. Today's webinar will talk through some of the points you will need to know to do a robust assessment of performance and some guidance and tips on what kind of things we will expect. We'll also cover how to use the OFS dataset. So we will be going through the slides with some time for questions. If you have questions, please type them into the comments box on your screen, and we will have some time to go through those after the presentation. So the assessment of performance is essentially an honest and critical appraisal of the best available evidence to help understand which underrepresented groups you as providers will need to target and at which stage of the student life cycle. It really underpins the rest of the plan, so you should refer back to the issues identified in your assessment of performance throughout the plan. In this session, I won't go through detail about all of the elements of the guidance. Rather, this webinar will focus on the practical elements of carrying out a robust assessment of performance. You should read the guidance and our Regulatory Advice 6 for more information on good practice and the requirements of the Access and Participation Plan. But essentially, for each underrepresented group, your assessment of performance should take into account a few things. So your own student population. So this is by looking at your own quantitative data, for example, application data or non-continuation data, other data sets such as the OFS dataset, and qualitative evidence to help you understand your student population. Your student population within your context. So this is about understanding what impact your context has on your students, but it's not necessarily to excuse those issues, rather to identify what those issues are and how you will address them. You should also consider your own student population within the national context. So that means understanding, for instance, how does your work align with the OFS key performance measures? What is your role with making progress against these within the sector? Things like identifying issues nationally with these underrepresented groups. Are there other things you could do to collaborate across the sector to address these issues and things like that? So your assessment of performance should help you understand what you need to do, both in terms of your aims and objectives within your plan and in terms of the interventions that you put in place to reach equality of opportunity for underrepresented students. So I'll quickly go over the requirements set out in the guidance. So this is Regulatory Notice 1 that outlines the requirements of an assessment of performance. So your assessment of performance must cover each element of the requirements in the guidance. So where you don't have data or adequate data, you must acknowledge the data gap and state how you will overcome this and when you expect to achieve this. So if you don't have data for a specific target group, you can use other evidence such as qualitative or national or local evidence to supplement your assessment. We'll go over that in a bit more detail later. So for each underrepresented group, you'll need to assess your performance in access, their performance in access, success, which is non-continuation and attainment, and progression. And so for each group, each of the underrepresented groups, the gaps in outcomes between the underrepresented students and their peers and the rate of progress in closing the gap. So the underrepresented groups outlined in the guidance listed here, students from areas of lower higher education participation, lower household income or socioeconomic status, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic students, which this year need to be disaggregated. So this is a change from last year. Mature students, disabled students, and we're also asking you to disaggregate disabled students into those with physical disabilities, mental ill health, and specific learning difficulties, and care leavers. In addition, you'll need to identify intersections of disadvantage, and we will touch on those again later as well. And so for each of these groups as well, demonstrate an understanding of your performance within the national and local context. You may also, where your data is appropriate, consider other groups that we know face barriers to higher education. So these are carers, people estranged from their families, people from Gypsy, Roma, and traveler communities, refugees, and children from military families. Within your assessment of performance, you should also reference your data sources and use a range of evidence to demonstrate a deeper understanding of your target groups. So some of the key issues we found from last year's plans, so there were some commonalities about where some information was omitted. So it does seem to be that some of these elements that were missing stem from limited available data. However, where data isn't available, like I said before, it can be a limiting factor, but your plan should address all required elements and detail how you will overcome this barrier. So, for example, where not all elements were addressed, some life cycle stages or groups were omitted. There were some misunderstandings of definitions of the life cycle stages. So, for example, progression was sometimes defined as internal progression rather than progression into employment or further study, which is our definition of progression. Success including continuation and attainment. So this year there's a much stronger focus on the fact that the assessment and performance needs to contain both. And where there was no data, it was often left out of the assessment of performance. Intersections of disadvantage were quite limited last year as well. We'll touch on this again in more detail in a minute. But it's important to consider how some subgroups may face even more extreme barriers to access, success, and progression. For example, the intersections of white working class white males from low socioeconomic backgrounds or intersections of gender and ethnicity. So, for example, we saw some plans didn't examine trends sufficiently. So by trends, we're looking for more than 1 year's worth of an assessment of performance. So if you don't have data for 2 or 3 years, consider how you might supplement that with other data that is available. And if you have small numbers, you could consider using data over several years to build up a picture. Similarly, commentary on your place in the national picture. So we don't want you to rely on benchmarking when you're looking at your performance in the national picture. We want you to demonstrate your understanding and how you're making progress against national issues rather than using benchmark to mark your place. And consider how you can contribute to resolving these issues and closing the gaps of equality of opportunity. Similarly, disaggregation was an issue last year. So we didn't actually explicitly say to disaggregate, for example, BME students last year, but it did demonstrate a quite deep understanding where we did see it. And this year it is a requirement to disaggregate BME students and disabled students. So for small numbers, like I said, these issues did seem to stem from small numbers. So you could use national, regional data, academic evidence, rolling averages of data in order to supplement where there are small numbers involved. And if you don't have your own data, you'll need to describe, again, how you will develop your data systems to capture this in the future and when you aim to achieve that. So we want you to consider and assess your performance. Assess the performance of gaps and rates of change over time. So this is a relatively straightforward concept, but we saw that some plans lacked a clear demonstration of this in previous plans. The data dashboard is the tool that conveys all three of these dimensions in a visual and interactive format that intends to make the information more accessible and easier to navigate. So it's a good tool to use to get started. So as you can see, the presentation of the data shows in this slide shows the gaps in each year and the trajectory of that gap closing over time. And this is what we want you to present in your assessment. So the data dashboard is a tool that we've provided to help you understand the data, but it's not the only resource we expect you to use. So your assessment of performance should use all available data to assess your performance, because you will have access to data that we don't have access to. So it's important to supplement it with as much as you can. So intersections of disadvantage was also a particular issue that arose from last year's plan. Again, intersections are important because the examination of a single characteristic may mask or underestimate the extent of a gap that needs addressing for a particular group. So the intersections that you identify in your assessment of performance should directly relate to your student body and help you identify where inequality of opportunity is the greatest within your own provider. In previous years, we've seen lots of reference to, for example, white working class males, which is kind of a classic example, but we do want you to try to go beyond this if there are intersections that are more relevant to your institution. So if you don't currently examine intersections of disadvantage, you should state why and how you will plan to do this in the future, again, because it's one of the elements that's a requirement of the guidance. But the data dashboard does actually include some of these intersections for you where the data is available. So again, a good place to start for that. So other examples of intersections you could use, for example, in looking at how underrepresented group characteristics intersect with equality and diversity characteristics. This is not a requirement, but it could help you an example of how you may understand more fully the barriers that different subgroups face. For example, Mental Health Foundation has highlighted that people identifying as LGBT+ are at higher risk of experiencing poor mental health. So you might want to look at something like how LGBT+ and mental health intersect to see if there's a correlation between those characteristics at your provider. Looking at the protected characteristics could help you also inform how your strategic measures align with your excellent participation work and how your equality and diversity work aligns. But again, these are examples. It's important to look at the data you have available to determine where intersections are most relevant to your provider. You can find more information on intersections of disadvantage in paragraphs 31 to 36 of Regulatory Advice 6. So the graph here is taken from Regulatory Advice 6 and just outlines how the assessment of performance really does underpin the rest of the plan. So it informs your aims, objectives, targets, strategic measures, and investment. So that's why it's important that it should be very robust. So we expect you to use a range of different evidence, as mentioned before. So the OFS dataset is part of this, because it does present a good starting point to look at your provider data and allows for sector comparability. But you should also use internal data, such as data relating to the transparency condition. So, for example, applications, offers, and acceptances for different student groups, or TEF data. There's other data you can use outlined in paragraph 22 in Regulatory Advice 6, and we'll touch on those in a moment as well. And other external resources. So external resources can help to further your understanding and consideration of the barriers to access, success, and progression for different target groups. And they're a particularly good starting point if you have no data of your own or limited data of your own. So the OFS has published an A to Z of effective practice on the website, which provides information on different target groups and different topics. Some of these guides also include links to reports that could be useful to help conceptualize different areas or supplement your data where data is limited. For example, the Effective Practice Guide on Care Leavers provides links to reports from the Department for Education and the National Network for Education of Care Leavers. So these guides are quite good to use to just get some conceptual understanding of these groups. So in order to demonstrate a thorough understanding of your performance, sorry for the typo on that slide, there's other sources and sector-wide evidence that you might be able to use. So for example, you could use data from HESA, the ESFA, UCAS, HEAT, MEM data, LEO data, your own data that we've already touched on. Local authority data, so for example, where care leavers are a difficult group to have data for, you could use data from other sources to supplement that for your area. Data and evidence from local enterprise partnerships, national and local data and academic evidence can also be used. And this analysis of explained and unexplained gaps, so while this isn't specifically a source of evidence, you may want to do an analysis of this kind to inform your assessment of performance. So some of the factors that contribute to the non-continuation and attainment gaps are structural, such as entry qualification, subject of study, and age of students, etc. However, once these structural factors are taken into account, there are still significant unexplained differences, and these are the unexplained gaps that we really want providers to look to see if they can get to the bottom of. So in summary, the assessment of performance should really help you to identify which underrepresented groups you need to target, where you can build on success, and where there are areas for improvement. The rest of the plan should relate directly back to the issues you've identified in your assessment of performance, and we will be looking for that continuity in the plans. So it's really important that you understand exactly where efforts should be focused. So we've provided a template for providers to use on the website as well, and we do encourage providers to use this. It's not mandatory, but we will be looking for at least kind of the headings to be referenced in the plan, as this makes it quite a lot more structured. And so we encourage you to read the guidance along with the Regulatory Advice 6 and the template to produce a structured access and participation plan. So we'll pause there for a moment just to have a look at any questions we've received, and in maybe about 5 minutes, we'll come back and answer some questions. Okay, hello, welcome back. We've had a chance to review some of the questions. So we did have quite a few that were similar, so I'll try to answer as well as I can. And also, it's worth noting, if you did have specific questions as well, there are phone surgery slots that you could book on the dates on the OFS website. You can also email us at app@officeforstudents.org.uk. So there was a question regarding context for small and specialist providers. So I think in relation to that question, so it could be that where providers are small and have specific kind of specialist subject areas, it may be useful to discuss that context within your plan. However, just be aware that the requirement is still to look at your own gaps in the student performance. So it's useful to understand what context you're operating in, but also the assessment of performance should identify the issues, whether those be kind of sector-wide or within your own student population. So just be sure to not rely on benchmarking when you're talking about context. The assessment of performance should be based on absolute gaps within your own provider. There were quite a few questions regarding disaggregation and small numbers, so where either numbers were very small or they're kind of inconsistent across years. So we would just advise that where numbers are smaller than 10, there could potentially be GDPR implications. So obviously don't put any information in your plan which makes students identifiable. So just be wary of using small numbers. However, in order to overcome the small numbers issue, you might consider, for example, using aggregate years, so using 3 years worth of data to gain an understanding of kind of that group or that disaggregated group over time. You could also use supplementary data, so data from other sources such as national data or research evidence, etc. So where disaggregation results in small numbers, you can use the same kind of strategies where your whole provider might be dealing with small numbers. It's using supplementary information. There was a question relating to the collection of E&D characteristic data. So where you do collect this, it might be useful to use it in your assessment of performance. Again, you don't have to. That example of using E&D characteristics as an intersection was just an example of other characteristics you could use to examine intersections of disadvantage. In terms of collecting the equality and diversity characteristics, you as the providers will want to consider whether what the responsibilities are under the Equality Act. The OFS doesn't monitor that, but you'll want to think about that in terms of the data you collect. There was a question regarding providers that have both direct taught students and franchise students, and whether those can be considered as one in the assessment of performance. So the requirement in the guidance is for students, the assessment of performance, to relate to students that are registered at your provider. However, we understand that these are kind of 5-year plans and situations might change. So if you're expecting a change in the relationship, for example, your franchise relationship, you should detail this in your plan and discuss that and what implications that might have for your data kind of going forward. So hopefully that gives more or less an understanding of the assessment of performance from the kind of policy side. Again, use the email address if you have other questions, and there will be officers available for phone surgeries and things like that going forward. So for the moment, we'll just pause for another moment while we set up for the demonstration of the A&P dataset.
Okay, so hi everybody. You can see on your slide it says Alison Brunt. I'm not Alison Brunt. I'm deputising for her for this webinar. My name is Matthew Jones. I'm an analyst at the Office of Students. And in this section, we're just going to go over a brief introduction into the A&P dataset that we've provided, where to find it, and how to use it. We prepared a short video about this, which we will play for you now. If you have any questions about the data as you're watching the video, please use the facility provided, and we'll try and answer some questions at the end of the video.
Hello. This brief video will give you an overview of the Access and Participation Data Dashboard that was published by the Office of Students in March 2019. This will be a high-level overview explaining how to access, use and explore the dashboard and the data contained within it. The dashboard was constructed using data about UK undergraduate students returned from higher education providers in England through the relevant HESA or ILR data returns. It also includes information from the Destination of Leavers from Higher Education or DELI survey, which surveys students about their activities 6 months after graduating from their studies. The latest 5 years of data is included. Students are attributed to the provider where they are registered. Note that this may not be always be the same provider as where they are taught. International and EU students are not included in the data, and we have published data broken down by those providers that are registered with the Office of Students at the time of publication. We will periodically update the underlying data to include additional providers as more become registered with the Office for Students. We also include data aggregated for the whole sector. This data contains all English higher education providers, whether or not they are registered with the Office for Students. To access the data dashboard, navigate to the Office for Students website at officeforstudents.org.uk. At the banner on the top of the page, click on the Data Analysis section. You can then scroll down the page to the Get the Data section, where you'll find a link to the Access and Participation Data Dashboard. Before we get into the dashboard itself, you can find out more using the links on the right-hand side. Clicking through to this section, you will find information about the dashboard and what it contains. Of particular relevance to this video are the links to documentation about the dashboard. In the user guide, you will find information about how to use the dashboard and the accompanying data files that are available from the Office for Students. The methodology and rebuild instructions have further detail on how the data resources were constructed. This includes details on statistical tests, the rounding and suppression that have been applied, as well as information to allow providers to rebuild the data from individualized student data. There are other useful resources on this page, including links to download the underlying data, an FAQ section, and a link, further information on how to contact us if you'd like to know more. We can navigate back to the dashboard using the link on the right-hand side. The dashboard itself is displayed in the section at the bottom of this page. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to use an equivalent version of the dashboard that contains data for a fictitious provider. To get the best experience, we can maximize the dashboard using the full screen icon at the bottom of the page. Tabs across the top of the page allow us to navigate to different charts. The Key Measures tab highlights data from those areas that the Office for Students has identified as strategically important at a sector level. The remaining tabs show data across the student lifecycle stages. Access, those students that get into higher education. Continuation, the proportions of students that subsequently continue their studies in higher education rather than dropping out. Attainment, the proportions of students that gain first or upper second class degrees. And progression, the proportions of students that go into highly skilled employment or higher level study after qualifying. I will start exploring the data in the Continuation tab. When we load this tab, we can see that there are 4 yellow boxes across the top that can be used to explore the different aspects of the data. The first shows rates, in this case the continuation rates for different groups of students. We can also explore the gaps between those rates for different student groups, the ratio between these rates for different student groups, and we also have a summary of areas that have been identified as having statistically significant differences between groups and their peers. Let's explore continuation rates a bit further. At the top of the page, we can select a provider that we are interested in from the filter. When we select a new provider, we can see that the charts at the left-hand side of the page will update reflecting our selection. We can also select different levels of study from all undergraduates, first degree, other undergraduates, or undergraduate with postgraduate components. We can use the other filters on the page to look at continuation rates for different student groups. The initial selection here shows continuation rates for 21 to 25-year-olds. We can look at data for different age categories, deprivation quintiles in terms of the English IMD measure, disability in terms of whether students are disabled or not, disability type, which includes a further breakdown of disability types, students' eligibility for free school meals at Key Stage 4, some intersectional measures, participation in higher education in terms of the polar form measure, and by student sex. Focusing now on the charts below the initial data selections, we can see continuation rates for 21 to 25-year-olds at the selected provider. Full-time continuation rates are at the top of the page. Part-time rates can be found at the bottom of the page. On the left-hand side, we have continuation rates for the selected provider, and on the right-hand side, we have equivalent rates aggregated for the whole sector. The charts show a blue line and 2 grey lines. The blue line shows the continuation rate for the selected student group across the 5-year time series. Note that the numbers in the dashboard are not exact and will be rounded to various degrees. If we hover over each data point, we can see more information for that year, including, in this case, numerator and denominator. The continuation rate is calculated by dividing the numerator, the number of students who continue their studies, by the denominator, the total number of students in the selected group, expressed as a percentage. The grey lines represent the degree of uncertainty associated with the continuation rate by an upper and lower confidence limit. Typically, where small numbers of students are involved, confidence limits will be wider. This reflects the sensitivity of the data of the continuation rate to changes in outcome for a small number of students. in this case whether they continue in higher education or not. Tight confidence limits indicate that we can be more confident that the underlying rate has not been affected by randomness and chance. In some cases, there may be one or more points in the time series that have been suppressed. You will see this as missing data points, which may result in discontinuous lines, isolated points, or even no lines shown at all if all of the data has been suppressed. Typically, this happens when small numbers of students are involved. Further detail on the suppression that we have applied can be found in the methodology and rebuild document that is available on our website. We can move on to look at gaps in continuation rate between different student groups. As was the case when looking at rates, we can select a provider of interest and explore the data. This time we can select a comparison between two groups within a characteristic. The initial selection compares continuation rates between 21 to 25-year-olds and 26 to 30-year-olds. As before with the rates pages, we have charts below displayed for the selected provider on the left and the aggregated picture for the sector as a whole on the right. Gaps in continuation rates are displayed at the top of the screen for full-time students and at the bottom of the screen for part-time students. The charts express gaps in continuation rate for the selected comparison as a percentage point difference. This will always be the first group minus the second group. In this case, the continuation rate for 21 to 25-year-olds minus the rate for the 26 to 30-year-olds. So here, a positive gap will mean that the continuation rate for 21 to 25-year-olds is higher than the rate for 26 to 30-year-olds. If the gap were negative, it would mean in this case that the continuation rate for 26 to 30-year-olds is higher. As before, the charts show a blue line for the percentage point gap and grey lines for the associated confidence intervals. Additional information can be seen by hovering over these data points. In these charts, we also have information on whether the gap in continuation rates is statistically significant in each of the years across the 5-year time series. Where data is flagged as statistically significant, it is less likely to be the result of random chance and variation. But a statistically significant flag does not attach any value judgment on the data. It does not distinguish if the data shows any good or bad performance, nor does it convey the size of the difference that is shown and whether it is important or not. Conversely, where the data is not flagged as statistically significant, it does not mean that what the data shows is unimportant, only that we cannot be sure that what it shows is reliable. As well as statistical significance of the gaps in continuation rates for the selected comparison in each year, underneath each chart, we can see how the gap is changing across the years. We are shown the change in the gap between the first and last year in the time series, and the change in gap between the penultimate year and the last year. We are also shown whether this change in gap is statistically significant or not. Returning to the top of the page, we can look at ratios of continuation rates between different student groups. We can select comparisons of interest in the data as before. Ratios are similar to the gaps comparisons. They are another way of comparing outcomes for different student groups. Instead of subtracting rates, as was done for the gaps, here we express the ratio as the continuation rate for the first group divided by the rate for the second group. You may find where the absolute rates involved are smaller, the ratio comparison becomes more meaningful and may allow greater insight into the data. The final selection along the top of the page allows us to explore statistically significant differences. As was the case in other selections, we can select provider of interest, and different aspects of the data. The tables shown below summarize all of the cases of statistical significance for the data that has been selected. The table at the top summarizes statistical significances for in-year gaps. Below this, we can see summaries for statistical significance of the change in gap across years. When selecting providers, the summary tables may be empty. This means that there are no statistically significant gaps or changes in gaps in any of the comparisons included in the dataset. This can happen where there are small numbers of students involved. That completes the walkthrough of the Continuation tab. The Attainment and Progression tabs have a very similar structure and content to the Continuation tab, so we will not go through these here. In these tabs, rather than looking at the continuation rates, gaps, ratios, and statistical significance for continuation, instead we can look at attainment or progression rates, gaps, ratios, and statistical significance. I will now move on to look at the Access tab. Here we can use the yellow boxes at the top to navigate between looking at comparisons in Access compared to the underlying population, the proportions of students with different attributes entering higher education, as well as a summary of statistically significant differences. Starting with comparisons to the population. As before, we can select a provider of interest and look at different aspects of the data in terms of level of study, either full-time or part-time, in terms of mode. The charts below will update depending on the filter selections that we choose. This section is slightly different to the other sections in the dashboard, as this data contains information for 18-year-olds only. We can explore data for students based on deprivation quintile, ethnicity, and polar 4 quintile in this section. The initial selection looks at deprivation 1 quintile 1 in terms of English IMD for all 18-year-old full-time undergraduates. The chart at the top left compares the proportion of these students that gain access to the selected provider to the underlying proportion in the population for 18-year-olds. For the deprivation characteristic, this compares to the English population. For the ethnicity and polar 4, this compares to the UK population. The gold line in the chart relates to the proportion for the selected student group at the provider. The blue line represents the proportion in the underlying population. In this case, the proportion of 18-year-old students from deprivation quintile 1 that can gain access to the selected provider is higher than the population of 18-year-olds across each of the years in the time series. Underneath this, the chart at the bottom left shows the gap in proportion of 18-year-olds in the population and 18-year-olds at the provider with the selected attribute. We have a blue line showing the percentage point gap and the associated confidence intervals. This is always the proportion in the population minus the proportion of the provider. So a positive gap means the proportion in the population is higher, and a negative gap means the proportion at the provider is higher. Next to this on the right, we have an equivalent chart showing the ratio rather than the difference. And both of these charts at the bottom relate to the proportions shown in the chart in the top left. The chart in the top right shows data for each attribute for the selected characteristic. In this case, we have information for each deprivation quintile at the provider. The chart gives the number of entrants at the provider for every 10,000 with the same attribute in the underlying population. So looking at the blue line, which shows data for deprivation quintile 1. This charts the number of 18-year-old students from deprivation quintile 1 at the provider for every 10,000 people that live in deprivation quintile 1 areas that are in the underlying population of 18-year-olds. If the proportion of 18-year-olds from each deprivation quintile match the proportion of 18-year-olds in the underlying population, then the lines in this chart would sit on top of each other. We can explore access proportions by selecting the yellow box at the top of the page. We can select a provider of interest and explore the data we are interested in. The charts below show the proportion of students within each characteristic at the provider. We are no longer restricted to just looking at 18-year-olds here. The initial selection allows us to explore the proportions of students in different age categories. The charts at the top of the page show data for full-time students, and at the bottom of the page we have equivalent charts for part-time students. The charts on the left-hand side show proportions within the provider, and the charts on the right-hand side show proportions for the sector as a whole. We can explore different characteristics using the filter. The final selection across the Access tab summarizes statistically significant differences at the provider compared to the underlying population. The table at the top allows us to quickly see where in-year gaps are statistically significant. The tables at the bottom show similar data for changes in gap across the time series. The final tab that I'll explain in this video is the Key Measures tab. This tab highlights data from across the student lifecycle that the Office for Students has identified as strategically important at a sector level. All of the data in this tab can be explored in more detail across the other tabs that we have looked at in this video. At the bottom of the page, you can find links to web pages where you can find more information about our key performance measures. The yellow boxes at the top allow the user to navigate sections highlighting access for students from underrepresented areas, gaps in continuation rates for students from underrepresented areas, gaps in degree outcomes between white and black students, and gaps in degree outcomes between disabled and non-disabled students. That concludes this video. For more information, please see the web pages mentioned at the beginning of this video. Thank you for watching.
Okay, so we're going to try and address some of the questions that have been coming in. The first question is the technical algorithms document. You stipulate that Polar 4 is just for students aged 21 and under. Why is this, as about a third of our students are over 21? So this comes down to the definition of the Polar 4 measure itself. So this measure is defined in reference to young people. It looks at local areas in terms of how likely young people are to participate in HE. And because of that definition, its application has most meaning when you're looking at young people. So it's not to say that it's meaningless for mature students, but there is a great potential for someone living in an area that differs to one in which they grew up if they're mature students. So what you can do for these groups, if you have less data on Polar 4 measures, you can look at other measures of disadvantage, such as IMD. It's obviously slightly different to the Polar 4 measure, but it will help you address some issues of disadvantage for those mature students. And you can explain your context and clarify why you're using these measures and instead of Polar to overcome the issues you have with Polar. Okay, and we have another question. We teach a lot of foundation degrees. Judging attainment by first and 2-1s would miss out on those who attain merit or distinction in a foundation degree. can we expand the measure of attainment to include foundation degrees? So what's in the AMP dataset on attainment is looking at first and 2-1s for level 6 and above, so foundation degrees would not be included in the data in the dataset. There are some issues in terms of the national picture of how this data is recorded and how we'd display this. But if you have some additional context from your provider that you can add in your assessment of performance in relation to foundation degrees, and this would be helpful for you to put in the plan. We've got another question. Should we be focusing on statistically significant gaps only in the dashboard? So no, the statistically significant markers basically indicate where you have good evidence in the data. In terms of judging the importance or significance of different gaps in performance, the statistical significance doesn't tell you that, and you'll have to evaluate which gaps are the biggest for your different student groups and judge which you think to be important. What the statistical significance does is give you confidence that you have a reliable source of evidence. If you have gaps that you think are important and not statistically significant, you may wish to look at other data sources to try and add to the picture and give you more confidence that what you're seeing is actually real and not affected by randomness and chance. Okay, so we had a few questions on limited data showing in the dashboard and using the possibility of using alternative data sources such as the TEF, for example, and whether it's advisable to reference this lack of data. And we would say yes, it's useful to do so. And if there are, this data set is one source of evidence, but we recognise that it may not be the full picture for all providers, and where you have other data that builds a picture and helps to add evidence that is meaningful, then it is useful to put this in your plans and give a rich picture for your assessment of performance. And we had another question about full-time and part-time and where we have limited data. Is it acceptable to aggregate these? We have disaggregated them in the AMP dataset because we know that there are quite different characteristics between these two groups nationally and face different barriers. Where it makes sense to aggregate full-time and part-time for your students, you may want to think about doing this particularly with small numbers. Just state why you're doing it and why you think it's appropriate to do so. Okay, I'm now going to briefly hand you over back to Sandra, who will answer a few more questions.
Okay, so we had a question around the kind of analysis of gaps and rates, and would we want providers to focus on year 5 only, or the progress over time? So I think the important thing to recognise in the assessment and performance is that we want you to identify where the gaps and rates in closing those gaps are the greatest. So for instance, you might have a gap in 1 year, but it doesn't necessarily follow through to all other years, whereas you might have other aspects of performance that show greater gaps and consistent gaps or rates of progress not improving over time. But we do want you to focus on kind of a whole picture and tell us the story, really. So it's obviously up to providers to understand and look at their own data and come up with your own judgments about what you think is significant and important to focus on, and explain why you've made those decisions in your plan. Again, Matt has just covered the issue about the difference between statistical significance and a significant gap in terms of what a provider would consider significant, and that is based on the evidence that you have and the analysis that you have done. So where there are gaps and where those gaps aren't closing, that's where we would want you to focus the most. So there was a question around institutions kind of targeting performance across the board, for example, continuation and putting in programs in place for all students. So I would consider this inclusive practice. So where you're carrying out activities that benefit all students, but particularly benefit target group students, we would want you to discuss this. So we are kind of, we do encourage and understand inclusive practice, and that would be an appropriate thing to do. But what you'll want to do is to identify what you've put in place within those activities or those approaches that will specifically reduce the gaps for those target students. So you could have a program that reaches all students, but what is it about that program that will benefit the particular groups that show the issue? So it's not that you can't deliver kind of holistic programs, but you will need to provide some sort of commentary and evidence about what that program does to specifically reach or close the gaps that you've identified. So it should definitely all relate back to your target groups based on your assessment of performance. So there was a question about very, very small numbers of BME students and disabled students, and where disaggregation can make them kind of identifiable or kind of meaningless. And so in those instances, so you will need to demonstrate disaggregation for BME students and disabled students, but you can use some of the other approaches to assessment of performance to supplement your data. So, for example, looking across several years, or using some local evidence about students in your area. If you're a specialist provider, other providers that have similar issues and similar students, what can you pull from there? So it's where there is small numbers and limited data, it's looking outside of, maybe even outside of quantitative data. You can supplement it with qualitative data. It's about building an understanding of those students, because we do know that the disaggregation can be really important. Okay, so there was a question about kind of how much the assessment and performance should fill in the plan. So I think what's important to understand here is that it is a lot of information, but you should be able to present it quite succinctly. So it's looking at those different groups, presenting the data, but also and kind of citing the data, but you don't need to tell us exactly every single aspect of how you came to that conclusion. It's just to build up a picture, really. So we want you to kind of tell us what you've looked at for each group in each stage of the life cycle, and where you've found gaps. But you should do that in a succinct way as possible. So you should try to get as close to 20 pages as possible. But if you go over by a couple of pages, we will still read the plan. But do try to keep it succinct. And then I think that might have been. All right. Okay. So there's another question about apprenticeships, and are all apprenticeships of level 4 and over with the HE component included, for example, HND or foundation, or only degree apprenticeships? So I guess the answer is yes. So all apprenticeships containing a HE component could be looked at, not just degree apprenticeships. And then so we will also be publishing this online, so you will be able to access the webinar and the information in it. We're also doing that for the other webinars that we've done. So I do believe the small and specialist webinar is up at the moment. This one will go up shortly, and we'll be sending the slides around as well. So yeah, there was another question about kind of how to present information in the plan. You could communicate the assessment of performance in graphs and charts and things like that, or tables, but you don't have to. So really think about what's best for how you want to present the information. I know there's probably lots of questions we haven't gotten to, but we will follow up on as many of those as we can. We will also look at kind of common themes that have come up through this webinar and review the FAQs on the website. So hopefully we'll be able to get those updated shortly. So as kind of some closing comments, I just wanted to say, have a think about what you've taken away from the webinar and how you might use this information to inform your assessment and performance. And if there's anything else the OFS can do to support you to understand how you can carry out a robust assessment of performance. There's lots of information in Regulatory Advice 6 on not only the assessment and performance, but different aspects of the access and participation plan. So we would very much encourage you to look at that. And so on that note, thank you all for listening and dialing in, and I hope you found that useful. Like I said before, check online for the dates that there are provider phone surgeries available. You can email in app@officeforstudents.org.uk to book into those. And also, if you have kind of questions, you can email that email address, and we will look to get back to you as soon as we can. So again, thank you for listening.